All right, now you'd expect that news of a possible common ground in Venezuela and talk of a possible reduction in the arms race would have taken over the headlines, but it did not. This is, after all, an angry and divisive Washington, which seems to find it all too easy to look past possible good news. Well, we'll get that divisive news later on in the show, but for now, let's explore these potential developments with Hal Kempfer. Hal is the president of the strategic risk management firm KIP. He's also a retired U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. Hal, good to have you back on the show with us. Hal, the president and President Putin discussing a number of issues today, as we mentioned. Let's start off with this new nuclear agreement. Is there any chance that you see Russia and the U.S. coming together with a new agreement and possibly even including China?
Michelle, basically the problem they had with the intermediate range nuclear weapons, the INF treaty, if you will, was that China was not a party of that. That treaty was signed when it was just two parties, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was a bit dated. That was one of the issues that led us to pull out of that treaty, was the fact that China is a major nuclear power, and certainly within the area, not just the South China Sea, but that entire region, that they should be a party to that. So if they're going to move forward, and I keep hearing START used as a phrase they throw out there, strategic arms reduction talks, if you will. But if they move forward on this, it would make sense to bring China in. And actually, if I was going to bet on this, I would say any new talks would include China.
Why would China agree to this?
Well, that is kind of goes into the scope of the discussion. It was very interesting hearing about the different topics that were discussed over hour-long phone call, talking about the Ukraine, talking about North Korea. Obviously, North Korea is a major issue for China. China is really not comfortable with some of the nuclear ambitions, if you will, of North Korea. And if it was China and Russia and the U.S. all working together, I think in the background, the thought is maybe there could be enough pressure to get something substantive going on the Korean Peninsula as far as what's often referred to as denuclearization. That would be an incentive for China then to join in with the talks with Russia and the United States to engage in some sort of reduction. And it's interesting listening to the president. He's not talking about just limiting the expansion of weapons. He's sounding a lot like President Reagan when he talks about a significant reduction. And I think that is the forming of a strategic goal, if you will, of this administration.
But Hal, if Putin violated the INF treaty, why would we expect him to abide by any other treaty? It seems to me that the problem with these treaties is a lack of enforcement or insufficient consequences for any party that violates them. So how do you address that?
Michelle, you're absolutely right. It's tough to enforce these treaties. The United Nations is there, but they're not really a party to this. They don't really have a strong enforcement mechanism. Basically, the enforcement is the intent and the goodwill, enforceable goodwill, I should say, of the three parties that would be involved. If China, Russia, and the United States are all involved, they're all sharing a joint inspection regime. There's a possibility of better enforcing this. With two parties, it's sometimes more difficult to do this than it is with three parties, because with two parties can kind of lean on that other party that's not going along with it. It might be a more enforceable treaty at the end of the day.
Excellent point. Hal, the president also discussed Venezuela with Russia's President Putin, and he said, as we played that soundbite there, that Putin says he's not looking to get involved in the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. Now, we know that Putin has been supporting Maduro, and even according to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, that Maduro was going to flee Venezuela had it not been for Moscow urging him to stay. So what do you make of that? The president seeming to give a different account of Russia's agenda as opposed to some other senior members of his administration.
Well, I think what he's given an account that is basically what Putin told him. He says, we have no goals of doing that. Of course, you got to remember, Putin is he's a very experienced intelligence operative, and he's very good at how he chooses his words and how he conveys things. And I'm sure that's exactly how he put it. Now, what he's saying on the surface, the overt level, and what's happening covertly are often two diametrically opposite things. What we understand is that there was some sort of plan in a place. I don't know if you want to call it a covert operation, but there was something in place. I've heard it called a 15-point plan. One of those things was Maduro gets on a jet plane and flies off to Cuba into retirement. That part of the plan was quickly undone, and all reports are that Russia called him and said, do not do that. Now, there are other players involved in Venezuela, and it may not have been just Russia. China's involved there. Iran is involved there, along with Hezbollah, which is working essentially as an agent of Iran. And then you also have to understand that the Maduro government is tied in with drug cartels and organized crime, and they don't want to see him leave office. So there was probably a little bit of orchestration behind the scenes to make sure that this turnover of the government didn't happen as planned. And Russia is assuredly very much involved, regardless of what was said.
Hal, very quickly, given these dynamics in the 30 seconds or so we have left, how do you see the situation playing out?
I think in Venezuela, it's going to kind of go back to a stasis level. I don't see any sort of anything like we've seen in the last few days happening anytime soon. It kind of took the auction out of the room. They lost momentum. So it would take a long time to get it back.
All right, Hal, as always, we appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.